Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
This is a podcast where we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, where we compare and contrast our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, Chris, we're going to talk a little bit more about leadership and what we understand about leadership, because I have been set a task. So I'm currently on a course for self-development is important, and I have been asked to write myself my leadership philosophy. So I've spent the last couple of weeks, in and amongst everything else that I'm doing, thinking quite deeply about what personally, to me, being a leader is all about and what my leadership philosophy is. And I thought that would be an interesting thing for us to talk about.
I think it is. And I could imagine if you took a random snapshot of the populace, the phrase leadership philosophy would send 50% of people to sleep. And the rest of the group would say, that sounds really exciting. So actually, I want to start by saying, while this might sound like a theoretical exercise or an academic exercise, as someone who is now in his early 50s, don't tell anyone. I know I look younger. You're supposed to say yes at that point, not look at me
Sorry,
with
I was
that look.
joking.
Yeah,
You,
I know,
you do, of course you
obviously.
do.
Thank you. I've been to a number of interviews from the time I was a director or more senior, and obviously more latterly, I've been a vice president and run large teams. And one of the questions I get every single time I'm interviewed by a serious organization is, what is your leadership philosophy? Or typically they might describe it as your leadership approach. So I'm not going to go straight into it now, but actually before we started this, and listeners, I have not shared this with Gareth, so I don't know what he's going to say and he doesn't know what I'm going to say. Actually, I wrote down very quickly what my answer to that interview question would be. Now, obviously, at some point in the future, someone's going to want to hire me for a very large sum of money, and you don't have to interview me now. You could just listen to this podcast and you'll find out what my answers are and critique them there and then. In fact, we'll do your work for you. Gareth will critique or look at gaps. But seriously, though, what's interesting to me, and I know we say this about lots of the episodes, which is even if no one listened, which we're quite pleased to say is not the case, we would have these conversations probably down a pub over a beer. I was really fascinated to think about the differences between how I might describe my leadership approach and philosophy and how Gareth does. Not because one is right or wrong, but it's this idea of how do we describe ourselves differently? Do we think about different aspects? So maybe that's a precursor to where we get to, but that's why I think this is actually not academic. This is extraordinarily practical, that I literally get people asking me, what is my leadership style? And I ask people to think about what their leadership style is.
I think it's really important. This literally is an academic exercise for me because I'm on a course. And when I was first asked to do it, it did feel a little bit like one of those bits of homework that you get on these courses. And I'm in my late 30s. It's been a long time since I've done homework. I felt a little bit like I had better things to do, like real work. And then I started to actually think about it. And you and I are both, part way through our careers, but long enough in the tooth that we both have been in leadership positions and recognized leadership positions. We've obviously thought and discussed leadership quite a bit on this podcast. And I know that you and I have both thought about, discussed, and developed ideas around leadership before this podcast in our careers in the various bazaars that we've been around. And yet, sitting down and formally writing out what my leadership philosophy is, within about the first 5 minutes of starting what I thought was an exercise that I needed to get done so I could hand it in and then potentially discuss it later on, actually has been really useful. And it really brings to life the reality of leadership versus the theoretical or conceptual stuff that you tend to talk about. Because you tend to talk about leadership in the round, generalities. You talk about leadership in the context of the situation. You talk about leadership theories. You talk about other people's leadership styles. Um, Very rarely do you actually intently think about, or certainly I don't, my personal view of leadership
Well, I'll
and
go.
what it means for me, not just in how I interpret it, but what it means for me in terms of how I want to be and be perceived.
I think, and that was something I was going to mention, which is what kind of leader do you want to be? And again, to continue to make this point, this is not a theoretical exercise. So I over a number of years, I've done mentoring and coaching to people, and one of the exercises I do when I start, partly because I think it's actually very interesting, but I want to sort of almost to demonstrate to people there are new things to think about they haven't thought about before. What I'll often do is I'll start by saying, what kind of leader do you want to be? So this will often be someone who's either a little bit more junior or in early stages of leadership. And the first thing that happens, almost invariably, is they look a bit panicked because no one has ever asked them what kind of leader they want to be because, well, I'm not really a leader yet. So that's the first thing. It's like, no, when's the point you're supposed to start thinking about this? And as you've almost implied there, Gareth, it's highly possible you could go through your whole career and not be asked this or not think about this. But the second thing is the answer I typically get is usually very good, but very one-dimensional. And by the way, it often will reflect their values, their personal values, almost more than anything else. So one person I spoke to recently talked about, I want to be a credible and honest leader. Great answer. And by the way, the thing that's interesting about this is that there's no right or wrong answer. And in fact, what I encourage people I've worked with to do is to say, this is not about you somehow trying to divine what I think the answer should be. We all have our own different answers. You should find your best answer. Anyway, so they start off by saying one or two things, relatively simple, one-dimensional things. And I've got used to this now. And so then I say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do some homework. What I want you to do is I want you not on the call now, but I want you to go away and I want you to think about the best leaders you've ever seen in your life. You've either worked with them or you've watched them or whatever. And I want you to write a couple of things down that you watched them do and literally said to yourself, that's really great, that is. It's that day that, I don't know, someone did really, really well and they pulled them forward and they said, this is the person that did well. Look, everyone, how great they did. It's that little touch. Or the day that things went terribly and the boss pulls you to one side, puts their arm around you and says, it's all right. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk about it. It'll be fine. Likewise, now think about the worst leaders you've ever come across. And at that point, everyone's eyes sparkle with fear and memory. And I say, I want you to do the opposite. I want you to write down all the things that they have done that you think were terrible. At the time, your skin almost crawled because as you watched them do it, you knew it was wrong. But it's not because I want you to get angry about bad leaders. I want you now to reflect, what's the opposite thing you would have done in that situation? And what's fabulous about this exercise is, and it takes time, and the second answer is better, but still not beautifully developed, is I finish it by saying, once they say, well, I saw these four things, this person was courageous, honest, whatever it might be, and this person was selfish and blah, blah, blah. What's the reverse? At the end of it, now I say, what kind of a leader do you want to be? And all of a sudden, this little light bulb goes off above their head. And they're now starting to consider, what is my leadership philosophy? Who do I want to be known as? What things do I want my team to think about me when they see me for me to be that best kind of leader?
Yeah, I think firstly that's brilliant, and it's a really useful way of getting people to get to that headspace. For me, what I found really interesting, and we will come on to sort of what I've developed as my philosophy, but what I found really interesting was it was really, really difficult for me to work out where the delineation was between what I want to be as a leader and what I want to be. And what I mean by that is once you start this self-reflective practice of thinking about what you want to be as a leader, one of the first questions you have to ask is, what am I currently? How do I think, really honestly, I am as a leader? How do I think other people perceive me? How do I want that to change? Which means you have to then start asking where and self-analyzing and self-criticizing, but asking yourself where you're not achieving what you want to be achieving. And that can be quite a difficult thing to do. But also what it starts, or certainly for me, what it started to do is get me to think about how I want to be a better person more generally. And we all, I think, in life have lots of aspirations, some of which we're actively working toward, and some of which are pipe dreams or just notions that one day we'll get round to it. And that can be as simple as, I want to lose weight, I want to get stronger, I want to go running more, I want to spend more time with my kids, whatever those day-to-day kind of things that you should probably do, versus those longer term, what do I want to achieve with my life kind of. And there's some quite existential questions about purpose and value. And it's really difficult, or it has been quite difficult for me to untangle that and distill that down into how do I want to change to be a better leader? Because as we've talked about in the past, and I think this is becoming, one of the kernels of my leadership philosophy, I suppose. In all aspects of your life, you are a leader, whether that's leading your family, leading your friends, leading random strangers that you're interacting with on a train, or the team that you're working with in your organization day to day. And I want to be better in all of those aspects. So it's been a really cathartic, somewhat challenging, a very almost a meditative practice. It's got me to a point where I'm now evaluating my life and what I want to get out of it.
I think there's so much in there. The first thing, I think you talked about this crossover between your personal approach and your professional approach. And I think this comes to a couple of things. The first thing is you're just talking about your values.
Yeah.
Your values as Gareth, my values as Chris. And these values are not business values versus personal values. They are values. And I think it touches upon this idea of, I've always believed this, and I think I've always seen this, which is if you understand what your values are and you can build and accentuate and grow them, you are honest and you are credible. One of the things that I'm sure we've said this before, or I'm certainly sure I've said this before, which is I'm not very good at Machiavellian, the poor version of the word rather than the real version of the word. Because I'm not, I would be found out very quickly. I have found that if I am honest, that's one less thing I have to worry about. And fine, people might agree or disagree, like or not like, but I don't have to then consistently worry about how I think people should see me and therefore construct this personality. So coming back, I think it is about personal values, but you talked about it being meditative. I was just thinking to myself, some people spend thousands of pounds in dome tents with smoke and shamans to work this out, when all they have to do is do the exercise I talked about earlier, and that is free, baby. You don't have to pay a penny. But I think it's really valuable. There's also, and maybe this cues us up to talk more about what we mean by philosophy, and then we get on to ours, which is, as we were doing this, I was so fascinated because as I said to you, the list I have prepared, which evolves over time, it still evolves. I even added something in this afternoon when I was thinking about this that I hadn't put down before, which was interesting in itself. I think I have a biased list. And I know we've talked about biased, how you're biased many episodes ago. Maybe we should revisit that at some point. But I'm biased by the fact that I wrote this list. I am constrained by the things I have thought about. And so one
Yeah.
of the reasons I'm interested in yours is because I want to steal from your list. I want to say, I hadn't thought about that. Yes, I want to be like that, or I think that's a valuable trait. And that's going back to this exercise that I talked about at the very beginning. I can see the look in people's eyes where, to begin with, it's what's the list Chris wants me to come up with? And I have to make the point, there are no points for coming up with my list. None at all. If you have the same list as me, that's great. And if it's 100% different, that's great. It's all about the best version of you and the most successful leader you can be. So I'm fascinated to find out what's going to happen. That makes sense. Should we start with a definition? And
Yeah.
there were two. I did my usual thing. Gareth said to me, look, we've got to be really careful. Sometimes we talk about these concepts. What we don't want to sound like is one of these blogs that says 5 ways to become more attractive to women, or whatever the blog might be, because frankly, you can go read those. So I apologize. I'm going to do a little bit of that today, but hopefully you'll see us run away from that quite quickly. I was Googling what is a leadership philosophy, and robertsmith.com came up with a definition which I thought was a reasonable place to start. A leadership philosophy is the unique set of values, beliefs, and principles that set the foundation for how a person leads and guides others. Defining a leadership philosophy can provide you with a roadmap and a structure for successfully managing a team or organization. I quite like that. I'm sure there's improvements we can make, but I thought that was quite good. It goes on to say one second thing. The advantages of setting a robust philosophical foundation are clear and can be especially beneficial during challenging times. Moreover, a clear leadership philosophy can also help you make decisions, delegate responsibilities, and manage team concerns. Because change is inevitable, leadership philosophies can and should evolve with time. That was useful in terms of what do we mean by philosophy, and I'm going to bend that a little bit later. A leadership philosophy is how you and your team are going to solve problems. And one of the things that is incredibly valuable as a leader is if your team either implicitly or explicitly understands and engages with your philosophy. Because if they don't know how you tick, if they don't know what you care about, if they don't know how you work, how you do things, that makes life more difficult. But the more they understand, the more they go, okay, I get how you work. I get how I can fit into this. Don't have to be the same. In fact, diversity of thought is brilliant, but at least I understand what you care about and how you operate and how you think. So that's why, again, it's another one of these reasons why it's not just this private thing on a piece of paper that you look at just before you go to that course where they say, what kind of a leader are you? Or the interview. Actually, I think it's practical. How do I best interact with you, Gareth? You are my new leader. I am in your unit. Help me understand how you tick. Help me understand your goals and motivations. And in this case, more importantly, values. So I thought that was really good.
That's interesting because one of the things that we've been asked to do once we've generated our leadership philosophy is obviously to discuss how we got there, what it is, and all of that good stuff, but also explain on the course how we're going to hold ourselves to account. And one of the suggestions has been, once you're happy with what you've got, and it, as you say, these are living documents, living things, and they will evolve. But once you're happy with it, and in my case, this will be at the end of the course. The suggestion is that I email this to my boss and anybody else that is in a position of authority that I work to that can then understand me better and then hold me to account on it, and also to send it to all of my subordinates and anybody else that works and joins teams that I am part of or running, so that they can understand me. And knowing that upfront while writing it has helped keep me honest as well, because it's not something I'm writing for me in a private diary. It's now something that I'm very conscious that at some point I'm going to publish and give to people so that they can say, really though, you say that, I'm not seeing that behavior, or and hopefully from that it will drive the change that I want to create.
All I can say is it's a good job neither of us are going to read effectively our lists out on a podcast that random people we've never met can see, because that'd be ridiculous. I started it by saying communicating to others will be valuable. I'll be honest, I am nervous about emailing it to my boss and emailing it to all of my team, which is really interesting because I've literally just said that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm nervous about, will people say, why have they just sent me this? Now, in fact, I should be clear, by the way, where I work right now, I'm picturing my boss. In fact, I have sort of some slightly separated reporting lines. And I think both the people that I report to would actually engage with that incredibly well. My team, I think, would engage well with it, but I think they would be confused. I think they would
Yeah.
say, I don't know what to do with this. I mean, what's your take on that? Is that a military thing where people are comfortable with that, or is it?
I suspect if you sent it to military people, as we've talked about in the past, during one's career in the military, they will spend more time reflecting around command, leadership, and management in a more formal way. So I don't think it would be quite as surprising and intriguing, but I certainly think you would need to explain why you're sending it and what you're expecting people to do with it. So I suspect it won't just be a fire and forget. It will be a probably, book in 30 minutes to have a conversation with my boss to say, I want you to read this document and this is why, and I want, but fundamentally it's about, as you said, you're biased when you're writing these things because it's about you and it's all from inside your head. So it's about getting honest feedback and getting people to understand what it is you're trying to effect in changing yourself so they can help you do that, nudge you along the way.
I think it's quite courageous, because I think I mean, by doing this, whether you've been told to do it or whether you do it off your own bat, I think that shows incredible vulnerability. I
Yeah,
am
I agree.
willing,
I think it
I
does.
am
But I think,
willing to declare the secret source of what I believe my ability is for the whole world to see, both up and down in my organization. And any one of them could laugh in my face and say, well, if you think you do that, you've got another thing coming. I think that's a really interesting point about just doing it, is a really interesting trust exercise. I was going to say trust
yeah,
building, but
I think you have to have the right relationship with your boss for it to work. But I think that point about vulnerability is really important because for this to be a genuine exercise in self-development, in understanding what you currently believe about leadership and situating where you currently think you are in that, you have to accept that you're not perfect. You have to really focus on what you're not good at and need to improve, and recognize that these things, development comes from being on the edge of comfort, and putting yourself out there and doing things that are, arguably make you vulnerable. But it's the antithesis of a CV, isn't it? It's, I'm effectively exposing to my boss, having, in a previous situation, written down all the things I'm really good at and why he should hire me so I can work in an organization for him. Now I'm exposing all the things that I think I could get better at or want to change. And perhaps that's a particular aspect of my leadership philosophy, is that I've really tried to think about what I want to be rather than what I am. Although there's obviously a bit of both. Shall we get on to actually talking about our own individual philosophies then? So should we do yours?
let's do mine.
See whether we need to take a break halfway through, or whether that takes us up to the break, and then we'll do mine.
Well, the good news, I'm going to pretend like nobody's listening, because otherwise I'm now starting to feel a little bit vulnerable here as we do this. I actually broke it apart in two ways. And you said earlier about semantics of what philosophy is and isn't. In previous episodes, we get very specific about what something is and isn't, like what's a vision, what's a mission, what's a purpose, all that kind of good stuff. In this case, I am abrogating responsibility for whether this truly is a philosophy or not. So I'm not worried about that. But I I've broken this down into what is my approach as a leader, and then secondly, what are the values I have around that. And
Okay.
to be clear, I don't think the values are exhaustive. I think there's certainly more, but this is, again, coming through this lens typically of an interview, you want to try and come up with something that's reasonably punchy and reasonably relevant. So in terms of my approach, the way I'm typically asking is, how do you think about leadership? And so I say these three things. My role is to set a clear vision, purpose, and mission to my team. My goal is then to explain the constraints or the limits of those activities. And then finally, to empower and support people to be accountable and make good decisions in the attempt to meet the vision, purpose, and mission of the goal. And I know that sounds reasonably textbook answer, but it's really important to me because it says three things that matter to me. It is my job to set that vision. Everyone looks at me and says, "What is it you want us to do, boss?" The second thing is, people are very bad at saying where the constraints and the limits are. In other words, I need to tell you that if you're within these bounds, wherever you land, you are all good. And outside of these bounds, we could talk about why that is bad. And the final thing is about empowerment. And I've learned this over many years. I am not the smartest person in the room. And by the way, I've met loads of people who say that and secretly think they're the smartest person in the room. I've been doing this for too many years. I am very lucky. I hire a bunch of smart people. Don't get me wrong. I have experience. That's valuable. I have the occasional interesting idea. That's valuable. But actually, for me to multiply any value I bring to an organization, it is about empowering and supporting my team. I literally say this to my team. I want you to have the skills, ability, and experience to take my job one day. If I have done that, I've done my job well. So that's sort of an encapsulation about, irrespective of what industry I'm in, what the state the business is in, what we're trying to achieve, that is a framework by which this is what we're going to do, guys, and this is how we're going to do it. The next thing is the values. And so as a product manager, these are to some degree slanted towards that world. But again, it's, you made the point, which is this is how you are as a leader, both in the professional as well as a personal life. So the reality is these things are applicable, I think, either way. So in no particular order, by the way, honesty and integrity is probably number one. And I worry about that because sometimes I will communicate bad news to people, but I feel it is imperative that the one thing my team can do is trust me that I am not going to lie to them or, say it's all going to be fine while I'm secretly packing my bag and running the other direction. So honesty and integrity is probably number one. Number two, continuous improvement. Look, guys, we're all wherever we are, whether you're a 52-year-old, graying, balding, slightly chubby bloke. I mean, obviously that's not me, because as we said earlier, I'm a gym bunny god, but it could be me. Or whether you are never led a team in your life, I don't mind. All I care about is go get up in the morning with an approach that there's something you can learn today. And if you keep learning one thing every day, after 30 days, you'll have learned a ton of stuff. And as a year, you learn. So continuous improvement. I might know lots of things. I'm far more interested in the things I don't know. Number three, be curious. It is the single most valuable skill as a product manager, but I suspect elsewhere, is be curious. Why? Why did that just happen? Whether it be, why does the customer want that? Why is this the best way to achieve this goal? Why is incredibly powerful. And it is, for me at least, I'd like to think, the chief weapon against assumptions and bias. Real world examples everywhere on this one. In my world, we will regularly come across decisions made by predecessors. And
Yeah.
often I hear the phrase, they made a stupid decision. Oh, look at those idiots. And oh, this means it's going to be dreadful for us. And my answer is, why don't we stop for a second and ask why? Because there might be a whopping great landmine there waiting to go off. And this terrible decision was the least terrible decision given that. So be curious about everything. Why did my team member, why were they quiet today? Why did that person behave in that way? Hey, this person behaved in a way I wish were different. Why did they behave like that? And how can we change that? This one's product management. Sorry, everyone else. Product management without emotion. Maybe this is true across all businesses, which is it's so easy to get emotional. Oh, why am I doing that thing? You've asked me to do that thing before. This thing's stupid. No. We are product managers. Let's do that without emotion. Emotion actually can be highly valuable to motivate us and drive us, but actually it can just as much get in our way and stop us doing the right things. Next one. This one is a newer one for me. And it's because I've thought a lot about it recently. So it's one of the newer ones, which is be focused on the mission rather than the task.
Yeah.
Because in my world, it is so easy to get caught up in the task. And everyone gets so excited about the task. Don't get caught up in the task. And the next one, which is related, is think 2 steps ahead. I'm getting much better at this as an older guy. I was terrible at chess when I was young because all I could see is when I take his castle, it'll be fantastic. 2 seconds later, I've lost the game. I'm getting much better at thinking a couple of moves ahead. When we do this, this is what the likely outcome is going to be. Okay, how do I make sure that that outcome is a better outcome or I'm ready for it? Last two. Sorry, cliches, but frankly, you knew there were going to be cliches here, but I mean these from the bottom of my heart. Teamwork always wins. Always, 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 always. And I know you're going, well, obviously. No. Heroes generally screw things up for you. How can you say that, Chris? We all need heroes. Yeah, but heroes are fantastic for the one-off. The moment you use the hero more than once, you have just built heroism into your plan. Teamwork is how you make it sustainable. And the last one, and in some ways the most important one, and I have been blessed over the years. I left a business a number of years ago now and sent my final email. And I got an email back from one of our engineers in India. And he said, Chris, we always used to love coming to your meetings because they were always fun. And we always knew you were going to tell us a terrible joke that we had to laugh at. And we loved it. We absolutely love it. So the final one for me is have fun. We are spending more time professionally doing this than we typically will spend awake with our families. And so therefore we better goddamn well enjoy it. And so that sense of fun, that's not the same as not being professional. You can be professional and have fun, but it is understanding, and this is probably more of a personal thing for me, which is if I had to be serious all my life, it wouldn't be that interesting to me. You've got to be able to have fun. You've got to be able to have a laugh. You've got to be able to have a joke. You've got to be able to see the light side and step away from it. So to be fair, in an interview, I probably would have cut that down or said a few bullets. But I think that's my philosophy and approach that I've used over many years and evolved.
I like it. I think that's really good. I was very quiet throughout that because, as you probably could see on the camera, I was taking notes.
I was actually in my own world thinking about these things.
Funnily enough, I've now made some edits to my leadership philosophy and making notes, and I will fully disclose where that is.
But this is the joy of it though, because
Absolutely.
it's that what I've found is good leadership is often things you do unconsciously as much as consciously. So I am willing to bet if you've written down notes, say, oh, I didn't have that, but I'm going to have that. That's not because somehow I've revealed something. You went, oh, I've never done that before. I want that. I suspect I'd never thought about it in that way before.
Yes,
And I'm pretty sure we said, so should we take a break? And then should we go through those notes? Because actually I'm genuinely, real time interested to hear what you think and how that makes you think and how that affects you.
Brilliant. All right, we'll see you after the break. Welcome back. So before the break, Chris, you went first, which was very brave of you, and you read through your leadership philosophy. My structure is slightly different to yours. So I've broken mine down into an overarching theory and then a leadership perspective, which is probably a little bit more about personally my role, what I do, and how I see that. And then similar to you, I've got a list of principles then. What I've done though is I've got my leadership philosophy for life. And then I've also, because the nature of this podcast is about comparing and contrasting military ways of thinking with the commercial world, I spent about half an hour today just going through a mini leadership philosophy for a very specific military context. So I've called that my warfighting leadership philosophy.
You keep doing this. It's like war fighting is way cooler than anything I would have said.
We'll get to it, and we can talk about why I think actually having a slightly different philosophy might be quite useful. As we go through, it's probably worth having a bit of a discussion about where the similarities are and the differences between what you've just talked about and what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to start with my theory. So I've said this before. Leadership is simply getting people to do things. Full stop. The difficulty comes in choosing the right things and convincing others of their merits and balancing how much you need to get people to do these things against the team, the task, and the individual. So for me, the idea of leading in its broadest concept is relatively simple. The difficulty is then choosing the right approach, and that's what this is all about, but also understanding what you need to achieve. That links straight away leadership to strategy. And as you've said, focusing on the mission, not the task. So hopefully I've got to put that hook in there.
I'm going to jump in immediately, frankly, just to ruin your rhythm, because I think it's much better than mine. But there was one thing I didn't talk about, which I think you've just covered, which is flexibility. Yeah. So when I was in the Royal Navy, there was a fabulous throwaway phrase, which I think is actually very true, but it just became one of those things you said down the bar, which is the word flexibility is the key to air power. I think the point is you can scrub out the word air power and put everything else, but I think a flexible approach to leadership, you talked about how you might go about doing that. And I think the implication is I would like to think my style varies depending on context, situation, and people. Yeah. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as part of my theory, the reason I've talked about and I brought up Adair's Ball, his leadership theory of team, task, individual, is exactly that. I think it's a constant balancing act. And if you ever sit back and say, do you know what, I've cracked it, that's when things are going to go wrong, because the situation continually requires refinement, requires adaptability, requires change. So the next section is then the perspective. So this is my personal perspective on leadership. I believe in the power and value of mission command. Collaborative, adaptive approaches are the best way of solving complex problems. So we've talked about mission command many times on this podcast. The idea of delegating down to the lowest possible level the decisions to actually make choices about tactics using capability to do things as much as you possibly can. And Rob Murray, I think, said a few weeks ago, we should be delegating to the point where it feels uncomfortable. And then the second part of that is adaptation and collaboration is the best way of solving complex problems. And so, a complex problem being one that you need to find out more about before you can know the answer. And this comes back to your point about not thinking you're the cleverest person in the room. And even if you are the cleverest person in the room, just recognizing that you're not always going to have the answer because you're not always going to have the right context or the right perspective or the right access or the right experience, and therefore a collaborative approach is always the best approach for complex problems. So it continues. While stepping up with what you've got and meeting the mission head on is laudable, failing to prepare is a direct reflection on one's leadership. Adaptive, flexible, and willing to try, but not bluffing. No cuff too tough is the mantra of amateurs. And that directly talks to a lot of the things I've experienced in my previous career in the military, but also personally. And I think I'm really kind of bringing out there some of my previous experiences where I have, I think, relied far too much on it'll be all right on the night, or, confidence will carry the day and I'll get through it, it'll be fine. Where actually I could have spent more time thinking about the problem, reading, understanding the situation, finding out the answers, rather than bluffing and cuffing my way through. And I think that is a problem that is probably an endemic problem in most organizations, but particularly in the military, because, as I said at the beginning, this idea of stepping up and meeting the mission head on, no matter what it is something that we absolutely engender in our culture. And sometimes that goes too far to the point where that just becomes the default.
Well, but what you're saying is something quite subtle here. You're saying be ready. Now,
Yes.
be ready can mean do a significant amount of work to prepare for the activity. Be ready can be the flashbang has just gone off in my training dorm. I now need to jump up and figure out what I'm going to do. That's be ready. There was something I wanted to pick on as well. Pick on is the wrong word. You talked about being ready to go, almost sort of, let's go, meet the task head on. I think you'd said something like that. I think there is a leadership skill, and I think again we're doing this. We're calling out things that I haven't written down, which maybe should be, which is knowing when to stop is just as important. Which is counterintuitive because as a leader, go, 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 win, win, win. Why would a leader need to know when to stop? Well, because let's stop before we drive off the cliff, because it'll be a glorious death when we drive off the cliff. But remember, it's a death, and the task then will not be completed. So I think there is a bravado about leadership that sometimes overtakes you, which is, I'm going to keep going because that's what everyone expects a leader to do. It's actually sometimes harder for a leader to say, stop, let's regroup, let's take a pause. Is this the right thing to be doing?
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect to stopping. You're talking there about stopping when things are going wrong so that you don't make the problem worse or you find a new approach. But you can also have catastrophic success, which is you identify an opportunity, you keep going, your team keeps going, your team keeps meeting, more and more success, and that overstretches everybody else, or that completely disbalances the plan, or that burns people out for something even harder that's coming. And in a military context, of course, there's lots of examples of tactical units who've broken through the lines of the enemy and continue to push on to exploit and reinforce success, and then overextended, and they get cut off, or the logistics tail becomes so difficult that the entire force culminates, or whatever. So I think not just knowing or being brave enough to stop when things are not going to plan because you're already committed, but also knowing the limits of exploitation. So that's what I've just written down. So that was the perspective. I've now got the principles, and very much like you, I've got, a bullet point list. But and some of these are very similar, and we can skip over them quite quickly. But it starts with risk is to be embraced and managed and not avoided. And I think this is a crucial one for leadership because it's where I see um, some of the biggest problems with leaders and organizations where risk aversion becomes a goal rather than risk management being a process that enables you to meet other goals. I personally, and this might be my bias, don't think I've ever particularly struggled with this one, but it is absolutely fundamental to my core about what makes a good leader. This next one I think is quite important, and I think doing this exercise and talking about this exercise is kind of talks about it really, which is I am always leading, I am always learning, and I am always improving. And that talks to your point about continuous improvement. And I think recognizing that I'm not a leader when I go into work, and as soon as I drive home at 5 o'clock, I'm out the office, I'm suddenly not a leader. I am always leading, even if I'm leading other people, even if I'm leading myself, the opportunities to learn and develop about leadership and the opportunities to apply leadership apply in all contexts all the time.
Can I make a point about that? Because
Yeah, please do.
I think this is another one of those things that it's really easy to misinterpret from people. You use the phrase, I am always leading, and I agree 100%. Put a different way, every single person, the moment they start a job, is leading in some form. It's just how you're leading is different. But
Yeah.
the point I wanted to make is there are some people that might be forgiven for thinking what Gareth says is everywhere he goes, he thinks he's in charge. And that is not what you meant.
No.
You did not mean that. What you meant was the values, the philosophy, the approach, irrespective of the situation, whether you're in charge, whether you're participating, whether you are a servant to other people like your family, you are always leading. So I
Yeah.
think I wanted to
Yeah.
call that out. Otherwise, people go, "Well, he thinks he's
Yeah.
right up
I think
himself. He thinks."
it's a really good point, and I think I probably this is assumed knowledge that by this point in the podcast, our listeners will know that when I say leader, it doesn't mean the leader; it means a leader. But yeah, it's a really good point, and it's perhaps something I need to explicitly talk about. So the next one: integrity, honesty, and moral courage are critical foundations. I think that speaks for itself. It's easy to say in most cases, it's easy to do. I am, I believe, a fairly honest person. I have, I think, relatively clear moral values and I stick to them. It's hard when things are murky. It's hard, so it's easy to say, and it's something that I suspect 99% of people, if you said, write a list of leadership principles,
I am a thief. I am a liar. I'm a charlatan. Not many of
lying and
those around.
cheating is always going to no,
Yeah.
absolutely. People are always going to write honesty and integrity because we all know it's that cliche bullet point trait that all leaders must have integrity. Integrity is really easy when everything's going well. Integrity is incredibly difficult when things are not going well or where things are going well but your moral values are challenged. And we've done whole podcasts on why teams go bad and all that sort of stuff. But constantly talking about courage and integrity and constantly reminding yourself to stand up and do what is right can sound a little bit
Sanctimonious.
sanctimonious, but constantly checking, constantly reaffirming that belief and constantly talking about and learning about what happens when it goes wrong, I think is a really, really important aspect of self-development.
There's two things in there. The first one for me is, and I don't know whether you or I have said this explicitly, but by definition, because what we're doing is self-reflective. My sense is there are people who are naturally self-reflective, and there are people who'd rather poke their own eyes out with a spoon than be self-reflective. Not because they're bad people, but because it's just not in their nature to do such a thing. But everything we've talked about,
Yeah.
is really fundamentally underpinned by this idea of examination, self-reflection. So I think that's really important. But you said something which was actually, I would almost argue, even more important. You interview 10 people and you say, what's your approach to leadership? And honestly, most people are going to come up with some variation thereof of what we've discussed. You know, even if they go look on the internet, it'll tell you all the things you've got to say. Does that mean that they're all going to be equally as good? No. Problem is, when things are going well, it probably will go fine. They probably will be all much of a muchness. We could have had Bob, we could have had Janet, it would have been fine. Where it really starts to tell, as you say, is when things go wrong.
Yeah.
And the military, I think, has a really good specific example of that, which is you've been in the field for 3 days, you've had no sleep, you have to make a decision where other people's lives are, you have to be good. And so therefore you're being reflective and thinking about these things and practicing these things, not for the good day, because that's pretty easy. It's pretty obvious. For the bad day.
For the bad day, yeah. So the next one is I will be clear in my command by very clearly articulating where I see accountability, responsibility, and authority resting across the organization and or team. We've talked about command and the military definition of command. Command isn't giving a command, it is the balance of those three things: accountability, responsibility, and authority. And I think it goes wrong more often than not because people are not clear about where it lies, where the limits are. And if you really want empowerment, if you want flat structures, if you want mission command, you have to be explicit about where those things are. So I will endeavor to do that. Knowledge is power, and I will share it liberally. So there's a famous quote, I think, by Richard Branson about, him employing clever people, and that's where he gets his success. And it comes back to your point about knowing you're not the cleverest person in the room. But Richard Branson takes it a step further and says, I deliberately want to be the stupidest person in the room. I want to surround myself with people who know the answers, who can achieve success. And I think as you said, teamwork is so important. So if you can inform people and empower people by keeping them up to date with what's going on, sharing that information. There are limits to it, of course. There are times where you don't want to overburden people with constant change, or there are things that are still tentative, or there are commercial sensitivities. And of course, that all needs to be balanced. But as a default setting, you should be transparent and share as much as possible, because that allows people to have the insight to say, oh, really? Is that what we're all about? Well, why don't we do this or that? Or why don't we stop doing that? Or, well, I've been doing that because, but now you've told me that, it makes more sense. So I think transparency and sharing information quickly and liberally is really important.
I throw one in which I forgot. Well, I didn't forget because I don't think I'd have said this at an interview. But it follows on from what you said. Words matter.
Yes.
And again, as we have joked about many times in this podcast, the fact that we're doing a bloody podcast is that I love words. I love talking. I love words, but words really matter. The right words really matter. And I think that goes back to your point about clarity and communication. If you can have all the right elements of a leader, and if you use the wrong words, they're running down the wrong road. So words really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. This one speaks for itself, and we've talked about it many times. I will strive to empower those that I lead. So, yeah, and that's how you achieve the mission command that I believe so strongly in. And following on from that, mentoring and coaching are part of my job, not an afterthought. I won't necessarily get judged on that. I won't necessarily get my, end of quarter results be assessed by how much I've mentored or coached my team. But it is absolutely central to making the team better, helping the individuals get better, and making us better. And the thing about coaching more than mentoring is you don't have to be an expert. It's just having an external opinion. So coaching is a two-way relationship often. So by doing that, I will also reinforce that self-development. I am but one voice in a much more capable system. And again, that's recognizing that the world according to me and my particular view on what is important from my part of the ship isn't always the case. And having that wider holistic perspective is really important. And also it reaffirms that idea that we hold our own biases. And so recognizing that I'm not going to boil the ocean, I'm not going to change the world on my own, but I can be part of a system that does. The standards you meet and those that you walk past are the standards that you accept. So I've adapted the quote that we've stolen from the Australian General to add the standards that you meet. It's a cliche of leadership, isn't it? But leading from the front, leading from the example that you want to set. So I fully accept I am never going to be the best at everything, and nor should I aim to be the best at everything. But I should absolutely aim to be as good as I can be in all the attributes and traits that I expect of the people around me. Not in their individual specific jobs, that's their job, but in the general values, traits, and characteristics. So if I want my team to be punctual, if I want my team to prepare for meetings and not waffle, then I need to be punctual. I need to prepare for meetings and not waffle. I'm not very good at that, and I need to work at it. And then, of course, the standards that you walk past. So holding people to account, it doesn't make you a toxic leader. Holding people to account and telling them when they need to stop their bad behaviors or improve makes you part of a system that is continually developing.
We don't need to go into this now. Holding people to account, there's a lot more in there, which is I'll finesse those words for me at least. Holding people to account effectively. Because we're kind of implying if you see something that doesn't meet the standards, you simply say, you are not meeting the standards. This is unacceptable. My experience in life is that can go two ways. The first way is everyone cheers. Someone says, oh, you're right. I need to do this. Another way, someone says, piss off. And by the way, I'm going to write your name down in my little black book, which is so there is a trick to holding people account in an effective manner. And by effective, what I mean is in a way that allows people to respond and sort of not back people into a corner about holding people accountable. It's a team game. It's a team game.
Yeah, and of course, like with all of these things, the actual living up to it in the context of the situation will take judgment and all the rest of it. Right, last few. This is a mantra that I've stolen from the qualified weapons instructor community, which you will know, Chris, comes from the Royal Air Force. It is the fighter instructor culture of which I was privileged enough to be a part of in the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance world. So it's akin to US Navy Top Gun or the US Air Force fighter instructors.
Royal Navy as well. Let's not knock it. People flying F-35s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is credible, knowledgeable, approachable, and humble.
Love it.
And the idea is if you are a QI and you wear that patch on your shoulder, you need to be all four of those things all the time. So yeah, I want to take that into every aspect of everything else I do. Patience when the mission allows, which is probably most of the time. So having patience with yourself, having patience with your people, having patience with the organization, when it allows, which is most of the time, is really important. So just because people could do things quicker, just because you've seen it done quicker in the past, doesn't mean that is vitally important. And I think for me personally, this is something I've really got to get good at is having patience and recognizing when it's acceptable to say, no, we've got to hit the deadline, or when it's okay to say, we could do this better if we took longer.
Anyone here who doubts that is thinking, oh, that wasn't very interesting patience. How many times you said, I'll do it myself? I'll just do it myself. Okay, you've just demonstrated you didn't have the patience. Again, to your point, very, very important knowing when you can have patience and when you can't. But I completely agree. 99% of the time, there's more room for patience than you might think. And patience means you are developing a greater ability to delegate and a greater ability for Auftragtaktik, mission command. If you don't give them the ability to learn, you're always going to have to be doing it. And that's where heroes come from. Oh, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. Apparently, you're now the only person on the planet that can achieve this, and you just got hit by a bus. The whole thing's failed.
Yeah. The final two are the ones I've stolen from yours, which is always be curious and know and be clear about where the limits of exploitation are and be ready to stop.
I like those two. They're good.
I think they're really important, so I've added those back in.
But as you were reading through yours, this is an unusual thing. I've never done this with anyone before, and I've never done it in a, as it were, private / very public, as in it's private because it's just you and I talking. Of course, other people are listening. I think there is a pretty high chance that there are many people, if they listen to this, would think, I don't know what the right term is, we're right up ourselves in terms of what a worthy bunch of boring bastards, just to be polite to ourselves. And I did think about that, and it does make me nervous, that kind of, class SWATs, they all think about this. I wanted to, and then I let myself off and said something quite unusual about myself, which is, if we were Olympic athletes and leadership was our discipline, you wouldn't blink at us spending all this time thinking about honing, refining, testing, building. And while we're not Olympic athletes, well, at least I'm not, I think you've got an opportunity for a couple of things there, Gareth, but I don't. Actually, I like that says, I want to be the best leader I can possibly be. And it's not about beating the person next to me. It is about literally the best leader I can be.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think it's a trait in the military, actually, is things that are obviously soldiering skills. So physical fitness, the ability to be accurate on the ranges, command presence. These are all things people work out, they judge other people on their standards for. Leadership, command, and management, institutionally, we work out. And I'd like to think as individuals, people do hold these things and work at them. They hold them in high regard. But there is definitely a sort of surly attitude to being a bit swotty and a bit overly professional, reading the doctrine.
Nerdy.
A bit nerdy. And it's always struck me as we are a profession. We're a profession at arms. And so, soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, it should be both proud to be professionally knowledgeable, but also work to develop. So I completely agree with you. I do think there is a risk that this comes across as a bit self-aggrandizing, but hopefully the listeners will take it in the spirit that it's meant. If you'll indulge me for the next sort of 4 or 5 minutes, I know that we are sort of going over time slightly. I just want to pick up on some of the nuances of my warfighting philosophy and where the subtleties slightly change. So the theory here is, I mean, it all builds on what I've said already, but the leadership theory here is the warrior spirit is the ability to get up and go, to ensure hardship, and fight to survive, and surviving to fight. Taking the initiative to achieve the mission and bringing those around you with you on the journey. So that's the theory. That builds on the leadership theory that I think I've already talked about. My perspective on this is warfare is perhaps the most extreme and visceral activity that takes the values and leadership principles of everyday life but pushes them to hyper extremes. The balance between transactional and transformational styles may swing from one to the other far more quickly, and the sacrifice and risk you ask of people and that will maybe ask of you will be greater. There's only then 6 principles to this. Understand the threat, understand the job, understand the team. And I think that reinforces in a slightly more war-y kind of way, team, task, individual. Be brilliant at the basics. Basic fieldcraft, basic soldiering skills. Doing the simple things well allows you to be excellent. And it's something that I've learned from the Special Forces community. It's a mantra that they use all the time. And you know, people who play Call of Duty or read books about the SAS or whatever have these ideas that these are superhuman people doing superhuman things with super technological pieces of equipment. And to some extent, that's a little bit true. But in reality, they are just brilliant at basic soldiering skills. So much so that it's muscle memory. So brilliant at the basics, continually adapting and continually improving. And I think that is a common thing we've already talked about. But in conflict, being able to adapt quickly to changes is how you survive and it's how you win. And this is a really important one. Humor and cheerfulness under conditions of adversity. So I think always trying to be positive, always presenting a humorous, a cheerful approach. So what I'm not saying there is, when everything's going wrong, just ignoring that fact, but taking it in the best spirit possible and getting up and going anyway, because it's so important in motivating teams of people to do hard things is to be confident and happy in your approach to doing it. And this I've stolen from you, mission focus rather than task focus. So what is it you're trying to achieve? What's the intent? Not what is it you've been asked to do right now? And then finally, and this comes back to what I've already said in the previous principles, but again, slightly more focused on a warfighting footing. Moral courage is harder than physical courage. Always do the right thing. And I think we've talked about leadership in the context of why individuals and teams do bad things and end up doing bad things. And in war, I think the extremes are such that can happen very, very quickly. And so constantly reminding people that doing the right thing is harder than the physical courage of facing up to the adversity that you're in. So that's my warfighting leadership philosophy.
I think that's a really, really excellent philosophy. My only comment is I'm not necessarily sure it's purely a warfighting philosophy. Clearly, there are elements of warfighting that are at the extremes, but I don't know there was anything you said that you couldn't just apply to a day-to-day. I wonder whether when you go to those extremes, these are the things you gravitate towards and focus on more. But I was thinking through every single one of those and thinking, yeah, completely, 100%. These are as relevant for me in my civilian job as they are in the military. Again, different contexts, different worlds, but I think it's fantastic. And maybe this is a good way to round this off, because I think we've come to an end for today, which is myself and Gareth, we're friends. We typically have similar kind of view. So at one level, you probably were counting there were lots of similarities there. What we're not trying to say explicitly is that this is the magic list. Add our two together in it. I think this goes back to the point about it's who are you as the most genuine you and best leader you can be, where you'll have all sorts of different people with different skills, experience, backgrounds. While there's probably lots that overlap, I don't think anything was particularly crazy. It is not about finding the definition in a textbook and doing that. It's got to be yours. So I would genuinely, we talked about that exercise right at the beginning. If you've never done this, best leaders you've ever worked with, and remember visceral situations when you went, that was great. Bad leaders, visceral reasons why you went, that was terrible, and what would you do differently? Start to build your own view of what leadership means to you. and discuss it with a couple of people. Go find some people to go down the pub with, or who care about this in the same way. I've found this a really incredibly valuable way of revealing to myself what over the years had been, as it were, organically developed ideas, but I'd never clarified them. This is really interesting. And then that bit where we're listening to each other and going, oh, I hadn't thought about that. No, that's absolutely right. You've articulated something I kind of knew, but I'd never done. That can be incredibly valuable. So it's funny, what I assumed would be quite a sort of academic-y, theoretical, what does leadership mean? Hopefully, what it's been for all of you listening is something a bit more practical and a bit more relatable to you wherever you are, whoever you are, and however you lead.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's been a really interesting episode. But I think what might be quite interesting is coming back to these in a year's time and seeing whether they've changed or evolved, or whether our thinking is still the same. But for now, I think that's it for this week's episode. If you've enjoyed listening, please do tell your friends, share the links, write a review. That's brilliant for us and brilliant for the algorithms to keep this thing going. Yeah, if you want to add your own comments or your own principles or aspects of a leadership philosophy that you think we've missed, then please do reach out to us, get in touch. You can find us on X at Battling with Biz, that's Biz with a Z, or you can email us direct at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. But for now, I think that's it. So I will say cheerio and we'll see you next week.
Cheerio.